Department of History at Idaho State University and is a participating faculty in the Department of Geosciences Geotechnology program. She has a bachelor from Florida State, a master's from Montana State, and a PhD in geography from Arizona State University. She specializes in environmental historical geography, GIS, cultural landscapes, tourism, outdoor recreation, and national parks and protected areas. And her regional expertise is in the western United States. She is now an Apple Distinguished Educator, which is an international group of faculty working to apply new technologies to teaching and learning. She has published widely, and in particular on national park related topics, and is currently completing 2 book projects. Her research has been funded through grants from the National Endowment for Humanities, NSF, Association of Pacific Coast Geographers, Idaho Humanities Council, and the Association of American Geographers. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask you, hit the button, Elizabeth. Okay. Join me in welcoming Dr. Yolonda Youngs.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the very nice introduction, John. And thank you all for being here tonight and sharing a little bit of your evening with me. So this evening I want to talk to you about Yellowstone and some of my recent work in the park. I've actually been working in and out of the park either as a researcher or some other things for quite a while. And so what you're seeing is a culmination of several years of different projects coming together, a team project, and something that is at a nice little sort of halfway point, but we still have some more work to go. So just to give you a little bit more background on me, and I only say this just because it will hopefully give you a sense about the project that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'm an assistant professor at Idaho State University. My specialties are environmental historical geography. So I'm actually a trained geographer, and I know I am among geologists, right? But we're all geo people, right? We're all earth science people. And we're all interested in, and I assume if you came to this talk tonight, you're sort of broadly interested in, and I really embrace the geologist of Jackson Hole, you know, interested in the world around you, right? And that's something certainly that is inspiring to me and got me into geography in the first place. I teach all kinds of different courses at ISU. I really like where I'm at there. It's an interesting fit. We don't have a geography department, but we do have a history department, and we do have geosciences. So as you heard from that intro, I keep one foot in each one of those departments. Most of my days are in history, but I also have lots of colleagues over in geosciences and quite frankly over in biology as well that I do a lot of my collaborative work with, including Dr. Crosby, who I think will be here pretty soon for a talk, Glenn Thackeray too, I believe he's come here and spoken with you before, so great folks over there. So my work, I actually am lucky enough to teach a park on my specialty, which is national parks, believe it or not. You can see why. Maybe you probably can't see me because it's dark right now, but I'm extremely excited to be in Idaho because I'm close to the Yellowstone and Tetons, my research sites. I teach world regional geography. I teach a bunch of environmental history courses. And my research sort of overlaps with those fields. Cultural landscapes, environmental history, and a lot of the things we talked about in terms of the national parks, but specifically tourism and outdoor recreation. And the project I'm going to talk to you about tonight kind of brings all those things together in a variety of ways. So that's my scholarly background. But I also have a very applied, field-oriented background. I specialize in field methods, geographic field methods, but I've come to know and love the greater Yellowstone area over many years of being an outdoor guide. So I worked, you know, as one of these folks, you've probably heard these stories being in Jackson, someone who came out here, fell in love with the place, right? Stayed 1 year, and then turned into 2 years, then turned into 3, right? 7, 10, right? That was me, you know. And so this was after my bachelor's degree in Florida, of all places, and I was one of those people who grew up in the wrong place. And I immediately left Florida as soon as I could and came out to places with glaciers and really cold water where I could get hypothermic and scared to death of mountains. And that was the Tetons. So loved the place a lot and spent a lot of time with it. And it was actually when I was working as a kayaking guide, a touring kayaking guide, and you can see me here up on Yellowstone Lake. that I came up with the idea for this project that you're going to hear about tonight, this thing that I call Digital Wonderland. So you'll hear about the development of this mobile app, but more broadly I want to talk about the potential of what mobile technology and digital technology might offer for us in terms of this bridge between scholars, folks who are interested in these kind of topics, the visiting public who goes to the parks, and just sort of park research in general, right? So, one of the things about going to the parks these days, and I'm sure you all either experience it or participate in it in some way, is that mobile technology seems to be really infusing that park experience, right? I don't know, many of you have probably gone to look at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone and seen a very similar scene to what I'm showing you up here, either an iPad or an iPhone, and in a lot of ways that's how it's sort of mediating that national park experience. And you can be excited about it, you could be frustrated about it. In my view, I think it's a really powerful piece of technology that we can harness to provide more information about the parks, but also in kind of an interesting way, make this bridge between the public and scholars, right? And so when you look at one of these scenes at, say, Old Faithful, and as Old Faithful's erupting and you see everybody pull up, as if they're about to salute the sun god, right? They all pull up their iPads and take their pictures, and their iPhones and everything. I also teach a national parks field course, and I take my students around Yellowstone, the Tetons in the summer. And this is actually a picture from one of those summer courses when I thought, wow, what are those people doing with their devices? They're probably taking a picture, yeah, or maybe a video, yeah. Some people, kind of put it down, and I could tell they were probably texting out something or writing a message of some sort. And to me, I thought, wow, this is a really powerful piece of technology we can do so much with, and it would be a really great way to connect with people. But oftentimes, I think it's overlooked, especially by scholars who maybe aren't willing or interested to take part in it. It's a very different writing style. It's a very different piece of technology to get involved with. And it really involves a lot of team and collaborative work, as I've found, right? The other thing that I want to mention here before I show you sort of the details of all this is that, along with the devices themselves and how that sort of mediates our experiences with the parks, there's also what we do after we put the device down, or the next thing, right? And for a lot of folks, it's social media, Facebook or Instagram, or getting on a web page or liking this or that. And I think that also offers us a really interesting and kind of amazing opportunity to actually gather people's experiences in the parks and perhaps contribute to scholarship. So I'll talk a little bit tonight about using social media and how we can use data that's what they call volunteer, in my field is called volunteer geographic data, where you actually volunteer information about either your location or describing a location you're at, or a location in the past, which is the kind of stuff I do, and how that could really help scholarship. So I'll give you some of these examples here, but these are just a few sort of intro teasers, right? There is, and if this was at an academic scholarly talk someplace, I'd have slides of this kind of stuff. But I just want to give you the background that there's actually a really deep, rich, and a highly, highly dynamic field that is developing very quickly. And it's called a variety of things. Sometimes digital history, sometimes digital humanities. But in general, there's a very quickly developing field that looks at exactly the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Not so many people have done it in national parks. Other international parks have done a really nice job with this. The Swiss national parks are developing some really interesting collaborations with scholars and the public. Australia is moving forward with that too. And there are certainly some select sites here in the United States. But the scholarship that I'm finding is that people are starting to really look at these innovative ways to use mobile technology as an innovative learning tool of some sort to either present visual content or textual content, maybe even auditory content. It's new ways of understanding the spatial aspects of tourism. So not only where people go, but where is the tourism development, where are restaurants and things like that, and why do we place those things in those kind of locations. It's some basic geography. And then, of course, another big thing that I'm interested in is trying to preserve as well as interpret cultural and historical resources, which of course Yellowstone is incredibly rich with those kind of opportunities, right? So mobile technology and mobile phones and tablets are all kind of within the purview of this project. And I'm very interested in bringing these things together. The mobile app that I'm going to talk about, the prototype is for tablets as well as phones. And it provides what I'm hoping to be a more conversation and collaborative experience, right? So what I mean by that is, and you all can test it tonight, and I look forward to questions at the end of the talk about this or interactions about it. But I find that a lot of the mobile technology that I've seen for mobile apps for parks is kind of a one-way street. You open up the app, you look for the location or information or whatever services you might want, and you get that information, you consume it, and then you make your decisions about your day if you're going to go to a restaurant or go to an activity. But there's not really a lot of opportunity for you to contribute to that mobile app. You can maybe like it, you know, or you can maybe send a comment to those people, but it's not really an experience where there's a back and forth conversation between you and the mobile app developer, and you're creating some sort of new experience in the park. And I'm really interested in kind of exploring that instead of sort of what I see as an isolated activity, right? So that's the other thing that my mobile app here that I'm proposing does, and we've developed this prototype to do, is really try to bring a place, a digital place where park visitors, scholars, park managers, park users, all kinds of people can come together and have this collaborative experience, right? Now, national parks, this is the map that I always talk about. In fact, this morning I was just lecturing in my national parks class. My students really know this map. This is a map of the United States, obviously, but it's also a map of national park units in the United States. If folks were paying attention, there was really big news this weekend. Yeah, the Supreme Court thing. But the bigger news was there's a new national park unit. Very exciting, right? That, I know, you are so calm about it, right? There's a new national park unit. So we've got 410 national park units, meaning that, you know, around the United States, there is a national park site in every state in the United States now, and some of them are called national parks, some of them are called national monuments, some are national battlefields. The Park Service has a number of designations. But that's an incredible geography and opportunity, I think, for sort of reimagining what those visitor park experiences could be like in a way that can bind these parks together, and then things that can be, you know, perhaps highlight the differences in these national parks. And I'll get to that a little later on in the talk as well, right? So Yellowstone, you know, many of you I'm sure are very knowledgeable visitors to the park. Yellowstone is distinctive in lots of different ways. It's a beautiful place, it's a fun place, it's really near to you all here in Jackson. But in terms of thinking about park research, you know, it's a really big park, 2.2+ million acres. It's a really heavily visited park, which probably I also don't have to tell you all if you were here this summer or last summer, right? Over 3 million visitors, and many of them seem to be driving up and down Broadway, you know, as you're trying to get wherever you want to go. It's outstanding cultural natural resources. It's the first national park in the whole world, so a lot of attention comes to Yellowstone for that. Established in 1872, established before there was a National Park Service, in fact. And as such, it has a really interesting and deep history. It also gets a lot of designations. You know, it's UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, World Heritage Area. Lots of wonderful things, right? And so it's within this park that this mobile app is situated, and actually I decided to develop the prototype looking at one place within the park just to sort of get us started. And that place is a place that's near and dear to me, the Yellowstone Lake area. So a lot of the prototype that you'll hear about is focused on that. So, you know, geologists at Jackson Hole, also I just want to mention, you know, Yellowstone's known very well for its geology, and certainly that's part of what you'll see in the mobile app, but I make sure that whenever I integrate ideas about ecology or geology or many of the other sciences, I always mention sort of that human interaction as well. And it's, you know, a significant location for, you know, one of the world's largest calderas. We have a number number of earthquakes there every year, the hydrothermal features, of course, Old Faithful, but many, many other geysers, hot pools, fumaroles, all these beautiful features that we love and enjoy in the park. And a lot of these things are what bring people initially to the park, but I think when they come to Yellowstone, there's other things that we can also teach and we can also learn about the park, because more than anything, Yellowstone's also, it's the nation's park, or it's one of a number of nation's parks where there are shared human histories and experiences that I think are really neat and kind of tie us back together, right? So I want you to, for tonight, maybe wherever you might be coming to this talk, if you think about Yellowstone primarily as a scientific laboratory, I know in a lot of the scholarship and a lot of my colleagues, they think about this as a premier laboratory for seeing, and working with wildlife and vegetation, geology certainly. And it is, an incredible place. But I also want you to think about, and this is what I argue in a lot of my publications, is that it's a tremendous cultural laboratory too, where we can trace major events in US history, in regional history, even state history, and how they unfold in this park. And I'll give you a couple examples as I move along, right? So as I mentioned, this prototype is focused on Yellowstone Lake. And it was just, it takes building one of these things, these mobile apps, and doing all these things I've mentioned tonight about being collaborative and involving scholars and the public and students. It takes a little bit of time to get this going, and I'm very happy and thankful that this has been partially funded by the Idaho Humanities Council. Idaho State University has also contributed some funds for this, but we needed to sort of find a point to at least start with. And so I started with a place that I had not only known personally, but I completed a good bit of my master's research on Yellowstone Lake. And particularly looking at this time period between when the park was established in 1872 until about 1966, just to have sort of a stopping point. And we looked at a couple of the historic and major developed areas in the park, including the West Thumb, not just the bay, but actually the West Thumb Village. And of course, nowadays you'll know the Grant Village, which is just down here to the south as well. And we also looked at Lake Village up here on the north by the outlet and Fishing Bridge as well. And for most of the park's history, and certainly for the park's history that I'm talking about here, these were major sites of visitation and experience. In the height of visitor activity on Yellowstone Lake, when West Thumb was full of hotels and restaurants and a boat dock and a campground and all kinds of things that maybe some of you remember or experienced there, and the Lake Village also had a lot of those facilities. There were thousands of boats every day in the summertime on the lake. I've read reports of up to 3,000 boats a day in the late 50s on the lake, right? So this is part of an accretion of history of people's experiences on this lake, and it's also sort of the visitor facilities that were available there at one point. And a lot of those facilities have been removed for one reason or another, and so those landscapes are tough to read if you're a visitor to the park, right? So Yellowstone Lake's history, just to give you kind of a sense of a few things that we talk about in the mobile app. Yellowstone has on Yellowstone Lake is the oldest hotel that's still in operation. It looks a little bit different now, of course. This was the first Yellowstone Lake Hotel of 1891, constructed in part with some help from the Northern Pacific Railroad and some other folks. As you can see, a really plain structure, not quite as dramatic as the very large, beautiful, yellow hotel that we know now on the shores. But it was seen as a preeminent and certainly very luxurious and nice hotel at the time, right? And certainly drew a lot of people there. And around it, a lot of development has taken place. Like I said, we know it today as the many times expanded and enlarged Yellowstone Lake Hotel, but it still has a tremendous amount of history. And there's a lot of structures around there as well that have that history. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to use these mobile devices in ways to show people. So if I'm interested in Yellowstone Lake history, right, which I am, and I know as a researcher, oh my gosh, the human history there, certainly some of the oldest human occupations on the east shore of the lake, but that more contemporary time period of sort of modern tourism history in the lake is really tremendous. And I've seen and read these documents and tour guides and photos and maps, and I would love to share those with the public, and I would love to do it through these mobile devices, right? And so these are some of the things you could see that were floating around in my head as I was sort of drafting the concept for this mobile app. I also want to just say behind the scenes, you don't get to see it. You see the products of what happened from this, but another thing that I work with is something called GIS, Geographic Information Systems or Science, depending on what side you approach it from. And this is basically a new era of computerized mapping, and this is what is behind a lot of the computerized maps that you see now. It also offers a tremendous database, and that's what, I know this is tough on a weekday evening to show you a table of data here, but it's an exciting data, and what you're seeing here is actually a screenshot from one of my graduate students who was trying to create a map showing us all of the buildings at Lake Village, which you can see down here in this sort of enhanced satellite image, all of the buildings that were at the site between 1940 and 1960, and she can highlight that data here, and it can show up here on the map. And so she's trying to create a series of these maps that eventually you'll see some of these in the mobile app as well, right? So this project, and this is the splash screen for Digital Wonderland. It's very interdisciplinary. It involves myself. I'm a geographer, and as I said, I work in a history department. My co-PI on the grant that funded this was also a historian. I have collaborators that work with all kinds of different visual studies. We have multiple institutions working on this, and very much a private-public collaboration. And I feel very strongly about giving the opportunity for students to actually get research experience. So a lot of the things that you see here were directed by me, and some of the original content was written by me, but it also includes my students having the opportunity to actually go to a real live archive and actually work with archival documents and develop their own way of interpreting these documents for the public and in a digital format, right? So just to kind of give you a little preview of what it looks like, if you were to go to your iPad screen, you can click our little logo here for Digital Wonderland. And as I said, the screenshot comes up for it, these home pages, right? And many of you probably have these smartphones and mobile apps, and you've seen these kind of things. And it turns out that creating this home screen took us about 3 months of meetings, believe it or not, and a tremendous amount of graphic design, and we had a mobile app developer that we hired. And we eventually came up with this design, of course, highlighting one of Thomas Moran's watercolor prints, and of course giving thanks to our funders here as well. And the idea for this Digital Wonderland actually comes from the name for Yellowstone. In the 1890s, starting in 1891, Northern Pacific Railroad started to call Yellowstone's promotional materials a Wonderland, right? And they were kind of building off of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and that Wonderland title really stuck. And if you've seen any sort of historic maps or photos or some of these brochures, they'll talk about, instead of Yellowstone, they'll talk about Wonderland. So I thought, well, let's have a Digital Wonderland, sort of a revival of that era, right? So if you go in, you'll see a couple buttons, and like I said, we're in the prototype stage, so we kind of have some basic things here. And the idea is that if this were live, you could hit one of these buttons and they would take you to different parts of the mobile apps. And so the big chunk of our work here is in these things we called site stories, and what they are is what we call place-based stories. So every I'm sure you all have lots of stories and your interest in the park, but what we did was we selected places that we knew there was something significant that happened at that place. We knew we had the documents in the archives or could get to those documents in some way, and we could provide some sort of a description of it. So I'll show you a couple of those site stories here in a moment. We also have a way that viewers can just, if they just want to visually just swipe through images and maps and see historic imagery or contemporary imagery, they can. If people want to just look by themes, some of this work was done in collaboration with the Yellowstone Park Association, and they have some interpretive themes that they want us to work with. And we're also working on some interactive games for people to use. So I don't know about you all, but if you've driven in Yellowstone in the summer, you've been in a traffic jam, right? And if you've been in a traffic jam and you've been in your car and you've had kids, you need to think entertainment quick, right? And so the idea was that the games would be a way for, if you're sort of sitting in a car and driving around and the kids or, adults want something else to do, you can click on these games and have very interactive ways of getting to know the history of Yellowstone. I'll show you an example here in a minute. And then I'll talk a little bit more about these social media links as well, right? So here's sort of a screenshot from our site stories. If this was live, you could scroll up and down this page, and when you saw something that looked interesting to you, you could touch it, and that would open up a short site story. So these are really short paragraphs meant to be read, obviously, in for sort of a brief while on your mobile device, right? So you probably don't want to look at that too long. And they're also meant to have accompanying photos and text and maps and other things, right? So remember, my idea here is that this app doesn't have services. I don't tell you where to get a good place to get a burger or where the bathrooms are, or what time the ranger talks are. The idea instead is that this is an app that's going to provide historical and cultural context in a way that people maybe have been able to access before. So you can see we open up with a little welcome to our mobile app. But if you want, you can look at a little bit of background on the fishing bridge, and you can see a series of pictures of the fishing bridge over time, the lake village and historic boat docks, the Yellowstone Park Hotel, and onward. And these are all, like I said, short stories. It was interesting trying to develop this with my students because they were so used to writing a paper for class. Right? And you write the paper for class, and you start off with an introduction, and then you have a topic sentence, and then you have a thesis, right? And so part of the opportunity here is to teach them to write science for the public, right? And to do interpretation for the public. So some of these things you get to see sort of they're trying their hands out at that, right? The real keystone of this, of course, is the Digital Wonderland idea. And as I mentioned, this is from, and here's an actual brochure from the Northern Pacific Railroad's campaign. And you can see they were trying to sort of build on Alice's adventures, but in a new Wonderland, right? So if you look in the foreground there, you can see sort of a reimagining of Alice, but ready to go for her day on the stagecoach and around the parks. And you can see sort of the outdoors in the background that she's about to experience. And if this was on your mobile device, you can simply look at the image. If you'd like to explore the image, you can tap on it and enhance it, make it larger. If you'd like to, read some of the writing on it that might be a little small. You can also click on the bottom here, and you could read what we call our little site stories and get a little bit more details. And I know this is kind of small printing for you, but I just wanted to show you what this would look like, so you could read through this and hear a little bit more, or read a little bit more about the campaign, the digital or the Wonderland campaign. All right. As I mentioned, there's also lots of images that are connected with this. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was the history of the West Thumb area. And West Thumb was one of the earliest tourism development sites in Yellowstone Lake, or at Yellowstone Lake, for many, many years. This was where, if you were on a stagecoach going through the park, you had the option, once you got to the West Thumb area, of either paying a little bit of extra money, getting out of that dusty stagecoach, banging around on those roads, and you get onto a boat and a steamboat, and then eventually a motorboat, and you could go across the lake. or you could stay on that stagecoach and you could go up and down the roads on the north shore of the lake. Either way, everybody would end up at the Lake Hotel at the end of that day, right? So it was a quite popular thing. People loved to get on the boats. It was, it's expansive. You got to float across Yellowstone Lake, get a little fresh air, see something a little different, and eventually the concessionaires and some others developed a small zoo on Dot Island, and there was a fish fry on Stevenson Island, all kinds of things that they put on with it. But when you look at this image, kind of think what you see in this image. I'm sure each of you have a different interpretation, but when I show this image to my students, they often gasp because, well, they're impressed with what these ladies are wearing because it's looking lovely. But they're also gasping because they're like, oh my gosh, can you stand right on the crust like that? Oh my gosh, right? It also kind of gives us a sense of these changing, ideas about the environment in terms of environmental impact. So it also offers us an opportunity to talk about safety in the parks and other things. Now, of course, the boat dock is long gone. They moved it back and forth several times, but if you go to the West Thumb area, you can still see this pretty prominent feature here. And this is in the early spring if you go to West Thumb and you're can stay warm out there. This is where a lot of the otters love to come and sort of feast on fish. So it's kind of a nice little site and a marker. So next time you're out there, think of the boat, right? And like I said, if you want, you can, if you were on this website, you could also, or on the mobile app, you could read a little bit about the history of that, right? So lots of different site stories, and as I mentioned, some of them have images. These are all historic images, many of them from the Yellowstone Park archives, and very generously they've shared it with us so we could at least make a mobile app prototype. We also have historic maps, historic postcards, and some contemporary image as well to accompany all this, right? The fun part about using a mobile app, and in terms of trying to talk about what we can, reimagining what you can do with these things, is this kind of an example, right? So this is a copy of Hayden's map from the Hayden Survey of 1871 that was really key for establishing Yellowstone National Park. And this beautiful and meticulously done map is wonderful to look at, but it's really tough to read, right? But if you're on a mobile app, you can, double tap it and you can enlarge it so you can read all these different parts of it, including, one of the neat things that they did, the Hayden expedition spent a tremendous amount of time going around horseback here on the whole east and southeast part of the lake, but they also took these little, what probably appear to dots to you are actually numbers. They also took some of the first bathymetry readings across the lake. And these were used to make maps for many, many years beyond that, well into the mid-1900s. So it's kind of fun to kind of see that and some of their understandings of the lake as well, right? And another thing that I want to point out is that with mobile apps, and as we've done here, you can read a little bit about the West Thumb area as we're showing, but you can also connect up to Yellowstone. So the Yellowstone Association, we connect with their bookstore. So if folks want further reading, they can click on these links and they can go directly to the book or the bookstore site and read some more. And we also have some websites embedded in here as well, right? So going back to our table of contents here, you can click on a variety of different things. If we click on images and maps, you have a couple options where you can, if you're someone who that was too much reading for you in the first place, you just want to look at pictures, you can do that. You can kind of scan through these images and pick an image that you'd like to look at, and then if you want to look at it in more detail, you can tap on that and you could see that in more detail, such as this map from Philetus Norris of 1881, wonderfully detailed map not only of the park and of Yellowstone Lake, but he was trying to map out a lot of the geothermal basins, which are those red blotches you see across there, right? Like I said, the Yellowstone Lake was a very exciting spot for a lot of early park visitors in terms of getting on those steamboats, and you can kind of, you know, it's an older postcard there, but you can almost imagine how refreshing it must have felt to be out on the lake, especially not on a windy day, but to see it out there in the open, to get off that stagecoach for a little bit and get a chance to really view a very different part of the lake, which nowadays a lot of folks don't get out to see that kind of experience, right? And then finally, one of the other things that we do is we've tried to scan and provide, when we can, historic documents, because I think it's very valuable for people to actually be able to read the archival documents in the original language that they were written in. You know, so this is, for example, this is from the very popular and very long-running Haynes Guide to the Park, and this is just one example from 1892. But you get to actually read it, and like I said, because it's on the mobile app, you can zoom into it, read a little bit more detail, and actually see some of their, and read some of their experiences in terms of how that tourism experience was in the late 1800s in the park, right? And then finally, I mentioned that we're developing some games too. This one is, of course, not quite live, but the idea is that it's a geography guessing game. So if any of you have heard of Geoguessr, it's a very, very addictive geography game. But it's a similar sort of idea, but what we're doing is we're quizzing people on the history and the documents that they've seen or been able to see in the mobile app. So with this example, the user would open up this game. They would get a map of Yellowstone that would come up on this side, and then they would get a random picture that would pop up here. And the picture that would pop up here would either be a historic picture from the mobile app or a contemporary picture, and with no caption or anything, the user would have to guess, where is this, right? So this one, you know, not too tough, and here I am standing up here and talking to you about Yellowstone Lake, so you're probably going to guess this is at Yellowstone Lake, right? So if you were the user, you could just sort of push your thumb down or your finger down and place your guess as to where you think that photo is, and then the user gets points based on how close their guess is to the actual photo site, right? So it offers a little opportunity to kind of give people the opportunity to read things, and then also once you get the answer, you can find out where, you know, there'll be a link to other parts of the app that you could read more detailed about it, right? So we're kind of trying out some different game ideas, right? I also want to make sure to mention that this project is part of a large team effort, and I want to make sure that I point that out and also thank the folks who have worked with me on it. Not only my project co-PI, Dr. Kevin Marsh, who's in the Department of History and specializes in Western US and environmental history. Also, we had the wonderful work of a mobile app developer that we hired from High Country Apps, and High Country Apps has been doing a lot of really neat apps for Yellowstone Flora and other nearby floras in terms of regions. And then I had two really dedicated Yellowstone lovers for students, Chloe and Caitlin. Both have graduated and moved on to new jobs, but they did a tremendous amount of really terrific work. And then, of course, I have project partners in other universities. Dr. Judith Meyer and Bob Pawlowski are both at Missouri State University, and they bring out field courses and have helped us to sort of test and develop a lot of this site. So that's sort of just to give you a little sense of the mobile app. But I also want to just kind of end with a little bit of the potential, right? So remember, this is a prototype. We developed it so that it functions, and you know, we can show this as we're seeking more funding to develop the full site. But the really exciting thing to me is the potential for social media here, right? And so we have links, you know, on our mobile app for stuff you all, I'm sure, recognize. You know, the Facebook and Twitter, Flickr, Pinterest. You can, of course, we've got to plug our own university here. But it's Flickr that I think really has a lot of potential for this public scholar sort of collaboration that I talked about. Let me give you an example of one of the early opportunities that we've had along that line, right? One of the things that that's a real challenge for this kind of project is that you've probably gone to a museum site, right? And you go into the museum and maybe they either give you one of those audio recorders that you could kind of hold up to your ear and listen to the museum or the attendant as you move along. Sometimes you can download a little mobile app and you can walk through the museum. Well, that's all great and fine if you're inside of a building with Wi-Fi connections in some nice city. But if you're in Yellowstone, the vastness of Yellowstone, it is really tough to get a wireless signal, much less a cell signal sometimes. So a lot of what we had to build into this means that the download for the mobile app is kind of a big file, but we also need to have ways to let people be interactive with this website and upload content and work within the parameters of what's available in the park. So I do want to mention, before I show you sort of the opportunities that we found here, is that there's some real challenges and opportunities with this kind of work. I've already mentioned the size of the park really can be limiting in some respects. I've done some similar work in the Grand Canyon, and also the Grand Canyon has some limits to it, right? Which you could easily argue is a plus side, right? If you don't want to hear people on their cell phone all the time, you might be excited about that. But other folks think, well, I'd like to have some cell phone connections for either safety or maybe check your baseball scores or whatever you want to do, right? The other thing is that for mobile app development, thinking about how are we going to get this app to this public that I'm so excited to get this app to, right? Are people really going to find this app before they go to the park? Where are they going to download it, right? And so that's where some of the partnerships come in handy, hopefully talking with some of the associations, the Yellowstone Association in particular, about making downloads available at the park bookstores, and trying to get over some of the challenges of coordinating between multiple agencies and multiple institutions, which these are all doable and we're working towards them. But this is something in the publications I've come out with. I've tried to talk to others who are interested in this kind of work. But the opportunities are tremendous, right? There's this really exciting thing that I think that there could be new collaboration opportunities that we've never seen before between the public and scholars who are sort of entrenched in this kind of work. I think it's really exciting to allow a little bit more access or a lot more access to archival resources that either are difficult to allow a lot of people access to because you just need staff to kind of monitor that, or they might be fragile documents that really can only be taken out of the box once every 20 years or so because they're so fragile. This is a way where we could scan that object or that book and then it can have a digital life, right? And the object can be fine in its preservation. And so I think there's lots of opportunities along these lines, right? So the thing that I want to end with is this concept of crowdsourcing, which maybe you've heard other projects doing this. Crowdsourcing has been very, very effective, I think, with connecting with citizen science ideas. So folks, and maybe some of you are folks who work with campaigns to try to monitor how many birds are out there seasonally, or what kind of animals are out there, or what the vegetation's looking like at different times of the year. My proposal is to try to use crowdsourcing to work with cultural and historical resources and actually create this thing that I'd like to know, or I'd like to call a crowdsourced digital history archive, meaning that one of the biggest problems I have as a scholar interested in tourism in the parks is that the stuff that I'm really interested in is actually really recent, like 1950 onward, right? And folks are just not going to donate that kind of material, your photographs and journals and whatever, until maybe 30, 40, 50 years from now. And I would like it now, for my research, right? And I also found that when I go to the archives, a lot of my time spent in the photo archives, especially at Yellowstone, is I look through family albums. That's what a lot of the photo archives are. And a lot of those historic photos you see are just people's family albums that they donated, right? And sometimes I think we all have the tendency to think, oh, it's just, those aren't important photos. There's just maybe the pictures of me and my family, but the rest of it was just goofing around shots in the parking lot at some restaurant, right? No one wants that. But it turns out there's me, and there's a lot of scholars like me, who are really interested in trying to reconstruct what these past landscapes look like that are kind of the near past, right? And so if we can have a way to archive these historic photos and documents digitally now, scholars will get the chance to use that for research to try to reconstruct landscapes, and hopefully the public will get the opportunity to preserve family histories because it'll be digitized, right? And it'll have a little longer of a life, hopefully. So I give this talk, or a version of this, to a couple different groups in Pocatello over in Idaho, where I'm from. And one of the groups is a continuing education group. And after I gave that talk, a couple folks came up to me and they said, that's a great idea. We have these really great old dusty photo albums, we'll give them to you. And I said, well, that's wonderful, right? And a couple weeks later, photo albums showed up at my office, and they said, go ahead, scan them. And so this was the deal. My students scanned the photographs and made them, digitally collectible. And then we gave these folks back their photo albums, of course, and then the digital copies of all their photos so they could preserve those. And then we said, can we use these as an example of what we could do with our app? And they said, sure, right? So you could see some of the potential here, and let me show you what I mean. All right, so many thanks to Bill Bryden, who was nice enough to contribute one of these albums. And here is the cover of this beautiful family album that he had. This album here is maybe 2 inches tall, tiny little thing. The cover that you see is a suede cover, right? And if any of you have worked with archival imagery or even old photos, every time a human hand touches this stuff, we've got salts and oils on our fingers, right? And so, it's a little deteriorated, but it's in really terrific condition, right? And it's a beautiful little memento from Yellowstone, but it's full of his family's photos. And you can see, some of the stuff you might expect, or it might be kind of fun to see, photograph watching the eruption at Old Faithful, and I love that they have the time of the eruption too. So this is a photo from 1927. And so there was a lot of photos in this album that were sort of the visitor experiences you might expect and the places you might expect. There was lots of really fun camping scenes showing us a different version of camping than maybe we think about these days when we pull up, right? Simply breakfast, but sort of looking at the campground experience, right? A little different than what we're used to these days. This is one of my favorite ones, and my favorite one for my students as well, simply called Watermelon. So they had lots of photos of this watermelon in their, or the watermelon eating, I should say, in their album. And if you look carefully at the picture and the car, you could see why they probably had a lot of time to eat this watermelon. And it's because of that, right? That probably did not take a few minutes. And so, it speaks to, for someone like myself, this speaks to a great sort of everyday experience of touring around in Yellowstone when the roads were dirt roads, and if they got muddy or lots of people were traveling on them, it was slow going, and you certainly traveled, with a full set of, backup tires and pieces for your car and tools, and this was kind of part of the visitor experience, is breaking down, right? And hopefully having fun together, at least I hope they were. They're all smiling, and you could see them kind of enjoying the watermelon. That probably did taste pretty good on that day, right? And then there's other stuff like this. This gets a little closer to my research where, maybe this isn't the first time anyone's ever seen a photo of the Old Faithful Inn, but in terms of having this photo, now I know, oh great, okay, well this is from 1927, or at least I think it is. It's from a 1927 album. The other photos are labeled as such. It's showing me Old Faithful Inn, and it's really showing me these what the typical road conditions were like that left you eating watermelon on the side of the road after a while, right? And there's other sort of images in here that, when I talked to Bill and asked him, and interviewed him about what these pictures meant or who was in them, a lot of the photos he kind of flipped through and he said, oh, these are just goof off photos, or these aren't worth anything. And one of those photos was this one that he said, yeah, I don't know, we probably should just take that out. And I said, no, this is the whole reason I did the project, right? It doesn't look like that's exciting of a photo. But what it's showing us is the north shore of Yellowstone Lake. And if you look closely, you can see this house here, which I believe is the same structure that was owned by the first, or one of the first Yellowstone tour boat operators who ran the steamboat across the lake, and so this is where his boat would end up every evening. Just off the edge of this, this part of the lake here on the bottom, you can't see it, it's out of view, is the big Yellowstone boat dock. And if you look really carefully, you could see in the background potentially a big wildland fire back here. So this is all the east shore of the lake, right? And so I showed this to a couple of my friends who do fire ecology, and they were like, oh, 27 fire. And then they went off to look at their maps and get all excited, right? And try to figure out what fire that was and what acreage that might have been. So that's just from one photo, right? So this is kind of the opportunity that I'm talking about, where hopefully people can have their past recorded and preserved in some way. Scholars such as myself can learn from this, and hopefully we can have a little dialogue too, where, like with Bill, I'm encouraging him to sit down and we're going to select a few of these photos, maybe 10 of them, and write a little bit of what he knows of his family then, or what time it was, or what they were doing, and hopefully that will help his kids and also give scholars a better sense about that tourist experience. Okay, so anyways, just wanted to present a little bit of the information, so thank you all so much, and I'd love to take any questions if you have them. Thank you. Okay, let's start over here.
And when you get this app developed, you've got a prototype that the other national parks could use. Have you talked to other national parks?
Not formally. I go to national meetings. There's a society called the George Wright Society that's specific for national park scholarship, and the Park Service sends folks there too. And I've talked to some of them, and I mentioned some of the international exhibits too. But I'd love to. I'd love to talk to more folks about it. Excuse me, let me get a drink here. Yes, sir.
What languages other than English are you thinking about?
Well,
I'm not sure if I heard the question.
What other languages besides of English am I thinking about for this? I look to the park model just because it's collaborative, right, with the parks, right? And so the parks right now are kind of also trying to figure that one out. And so the official languages, English, I think English, German, Japanese, Spanish, I think they're starting to get, right? But they need to get a lot more. In terms of development, but that's going to be way, way down the line, right? Because I have to get all this content together and then start to get interpreters for it. But that's certainly another phase I'd love to do. And I think it's we're at 2016, right? The year 2016, which is huge for the national parks. You probably all know this because you live in Jackson, right? But this is, here we are at 1916, the Park Service established 2016. Now we've had 100 years of the Park Service. And the Park Service is thinking about what's the next 100 years going to be. And certainly, you asked about languages, but certainly thinking about diverse tourist experiences and trying to make that experience approachable and interesting for more people is a big thing for the parks, and certainly will have to be for any kind of mobile app like this. So I'm thinking, I haven't done yet. Yeah.
Many go to the park for the Flora, Fauna, Archaeology. Are you thinking of incorporating that into this project?
Yeah, and it is in the project, and I might not have brought it, I always got to figure out what I'm going to choose for these things, but that's the environmental history, right? So yes, I'm bringing it in, but instead of, there's a lot of apps already for the parks. There's already a lot of apps for Yellowstone, right? And so this app isn't specifically just for geology or just for flora, but what I do is when I do talk about the forest ecosystem, or as a lot of times when I'm at West Thumb, or the app is at West Thumb, I talk about the geology of a geothermal basin. I integrate that with the human experience. So I'll say, I'll try to talk about the different types of geothermal features found in Yellowstone, and then I'll show a historic picture, and I'll say, here you could see the president and his wife standing on fishing cone, say a little safety thing, like we don't do that anymore, and then talk about different types of geothermal features, right? So I don't I try not to just separate it out into just vegetation or just geology or just for, whatever. I try to integrate it into that human experience and do something a little different with it. But yeah, that's a huge part of the visitation for the park too. But there's also a lot of people doing it, Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
So are the Yellowstone apps and your Yellowstone apps, are they free or do you buy them? And how does all that work?
Yeah, how does all that work? Yeah. The answer, so the question was for the Yellowstone apps, are they free or do you buy them, and how does all that work? Some of the apps you have to pay for a nominal fee. It's usually like $2.99 or less sometimes. And there's a plethora of mobile app developers. I mean, I am in no way the first to this kind of concept of mobile app development for the parks. And there are companies that all they do is mobile app development for national parks. And you'll see them, there's a company called Humanities that they seem to do all the major parks. And there's a number of companies that have developed for Yellowstone. There's only one, the Park Service has been selective about who they want to partnership with to say is their official app, right? And so when the Park Service partners with someone, I think they require that the app is free for download in some way. For us, it's very important to me that it's free. Or if we charge anything, we're very clear that it directly goes to the maintenance of the mobile app. So, even if after I publish the whole app, I still have to keep a mobile app developer on payroll because there's going to be, Apple, they're going to have a new update, right? And as soon as they do that, or anyone, right? As soon as they do that, my app doesn't work. So, nominal fees, some of them are free, some of them charge quite a bit of money. And it depends. And if you go on, and you can go online too and look for mobile apps. I don't know if you've done this, but you can go online, look for mobile apps, pick your park that you want to look for, and then just say, Yellowstone mobile apps or Yosemite mobile apps, and you'll just see a bunch of apps that come up, But most of those apps are focused on visitor services, which is terrific, but showing you where the roads are, where the restaurants are, where you can get some place to eat and sleep and all that kind of good stuff. And some of them provide some interpretive content too. But we're trying to do something a little different in terms of really bringing scholars and the public together and having a different conversation. That answers way more than you ever asked for. Didn't you say that? Does that help?
That was perfect.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah.
What kind of information does the app collect? Any information about the user?
Not yet. That's a whole another interesting territory to get into, right? Because then you have to accept, may this thing that I carry around track me, right? And I'm not really interested in tracking people so much, like that kind of volunteer geographic data. That some of my colleagues, that's specifically what they work on, and they're very curious to see where people go. For this, I'm more interested in you volunteer your experience in the park. So, for example, if you were to tap on, there's going to be a part where you can see a historic picture. Like say that picture I have the two women standing at West Thumb, right? There's going to be a part of the app where you can see that picture, and you can hold, if you have a tablet, you can hold it up, and you can have a little slider so you can see the historic picture, and it can go into transparency so you can see what it looks like now. So you can kind of line up the historic picture and stand right where they one of those then and now things, And so when we develop that part of it, I'd like people, if they feel comfortable, and this is all volunteer stuff, type into it and say, tell me, what did you think of that? Did you know there was a steamboat ferry there? Do you see otters on that rock that day you're there? Is there a forest fire going on? Is it crowded? Whatever, I'm interested in, that's the kind of data I'd like people to volunteer and to interact with the images. So I'm also hoping that through that, the Flickr site, people can post their pictures from their family albums. They can post a short thing with it and say, hey, this is my grandmother at Old Faithful this year, and my brother Ray, and we were doing this, or whatever, they were doing this, right? And then someone else can go on and say, oh my gosh, I have almost the same picture. I think my family might have been there at the same time, and I'm hoping for that kind of experience. That's the volunteer data I'm interested in.
But when you buy or when you download it for free, do you know the person's name, email, anything like that?
I think we can we can know that kind of information, but I don't think necessarily we have to. You know, that's also part of the, you know, this is sort of the many-headed hydra of, you know, what parts of this do I want to explore? But that's something that's potential, right? I mean, it's in your phone, and it's a matter of, do you say yes, you agree to that, or click the little slider thing. I have a colleague who does really fascinating stuff, who's been really supportive for this in Estonia, and he does maybe something that you might think of. He, and this is, I don't know how they did this in Estonia, but he got the cell phone records for every mobile phone owner in Estonia. Like, this is not the United States, right? And he and his lab track these phones, and so they can find out the people's names and then what language they sign up for when they get their contract. So they can find out if they're Estonian or Russian, depending on probably what language they say they want the phone to be in, right? And then they track them, and they can show over time that during the daytime, everyone comes into the center of the city, and at nighttime, certain groups go out to the edges of the city. And so he's using that as not really volunteer data, you know, but somehow he's got an agreement with the phone companies there that he can track this data, and he's using it to show segregation within the city. But that's a whole different country, a whole different thing. That's, yeah, interesting stuff, you know, very interesting stuff, yeah. Way more than you asked, sorry. I'm so excited about this project. I'm way too talkative. Other questions? Yeah, John?
When will this be live?
As soon as the National Endowment for the Humanities gives me more money. Yeah, I'm looking for, so the prototype we released, we did a really limited release just to the Idaho Humanities Council and some of the administrators at ISU who supported and wanted to see the project. But the full app, we have to develop more of the content for it. So unfortunately, several years down the line, because we have to go through a whole, you know, we've developed it now just for this one part of the park, but we don't, you know, we're bringing on collaborators to, hopefully, to talk about Old Faithful and Canyon. We have all these other parts of the park that we have to work on too, so several years, yeah.
In your discussion with the park, do you ever get into the lack of internet connection or cell phone connection? So take a picture, somebody thinks they're somewhere, but they're actually somewhere else. You end up with a picture that's misidentified.
Yeah,
Whereas if you had good cell phone connections, it would give you the exact location. They actually know where they are.
Yeah.
Any discussion along those lines?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I'm trying to, wherever they want to be with it. But I mean, it's a challenge for developing this app for this park. If I was working in a smaller park unit or a unit with more connectivity, it'd be a different discussion. And I think the Park Service is moving forward to put up, I think, more cell towers, but I'm not sure where they're at with that. I can't speak to the Park Service policy on that. But that's where I'm saying on our end, all we can do is work with what the situation is, which is there's not a lot of connectivity until you go to your hotel or restaurant.
You don't even have connectivity to Lake.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. So, you know, it's really very few places in the park that you can be sure to get, and then it depends on your carrier, right, and all these other things, right? And so that's where I was saying that the app has to be a standalone download, and then we try to educate the user or the purchaser that, you know, please give us this information, you know, type your experiences when you go to West Thumb or whatever, and then when you go home, or when you go to the Gateway community or where, you know, whatever, we try to educate people that, you know, but be aware that to upload this information or your pictures, you'll have to go to a Wi-Fi connection or potentially work with Yellowstone. You know, we might be trying to work with Yellowstone Association bookstores too that can help us with a little bit of this, but it's a challenge, you know, it's a challenge for this part, yeah. Yeah.
Does it go live when you upload it? Is there an editor that goes to the content before it becomes public?
Yeah, and that's part of why I went with why I went with Flickr, actually. And the Park Service has a Flickr site too, which is where I got the idea for it. The Park Service, NPS, and then Yellowstone National Park, and other parks too. And so they have their content managers and editors that go through for appropriate content before they release it. So there is a delay. And then in terms of that content being shown on our mobile app, that will go through our content managers too. And then we're hoping to develop a website to go with it as well, so it's a little quicker for folks. So maybe if people get home and they realize, oh, I wish I could have added this sentence or uploaded this photo, they can do it through the website as well. But yeah, that's another big concern, right? It's all this stuff behind the background. It sounds like such a good idea, and then you get into all this technical stuff behind, right? Yeah, other questions?
Before we break up, and everybody knows the drill, I think, these chairs go that way, those chairs go that way. I want to thank Dr. Youngs on behalf of the geologists at Jackson Hole for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all.
And she'll be up here for a minute to answer any questions
Yeah.
you didn't want to ask out loud.